She took the job as his private nurse, bound by a contract that strictly forbade romance. But as she began discovering dark secrets within the walls of his mansion, she realized the no-love clause would be the least of her worries. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Absolutely not, Vanessa. I won't have another one of your hand-picked nurses treating me like a child. The shout echoed through the marble foyer of the Thaddeus estate, causing Grace Mitchell to freeze mid-step. She glanced at her watch, 9:55 a.m., 5 minutes early for her interview. The mahogany double doors before her suddenly felt more imposing than when she'd first approached them. "Mr. Thaddeus needs time to cool down," the security guard warned, his weathered face sympathetic. "Though between you and me, miss, that's about as cool as he gets these days." Another crash resonated from inside, followed by the sharp click of heels against hardwood. The door flew open, revealing a woman in her mid-30s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal pantsuit. Her mascara was slightly smudged at the corners, the only indication that the argument had affected her at all. "Grace Mitchell?" Her voice was surprisingly composed. "I'm Vanessa Thaddeus. You're early, good. Though perhaps not the best timing." She gestured Grace inside, her French manicure catching the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. The foyer opened into a great room that belonged in an architectural magazine, though Grace's attention was drawn to the overturned side table and scattered books near a closed door. Vanessa smoothly steered her away from the scene. "You understand, of course, that my brother is adjusting." Vanessa's tone suggested this was a generous description. "The accident was 6 months ago, and he's still struggling to accept his new reality." Grace nodded, her nursing experience kicking in. Adaptation periods vary greatly with spinal cord injuries, both physically and emotionally. "Yes, well, he's had plenty of time to adapt," Vanessa replied curtly, leading Grace into a study. "That's why you're here. Your reputation precedes you, Ms. Mitchell. 3 years at Mount Sinai's Rehabilitation Center, specializing in difficult cases. Perfect attendance record. Glowing recommendations." She gestured to a leather chair across from an imposing desk. Grace sat, noting how Vanessa remained standing, using height to establish dominance. "Classic power play. The position offers significant compensation," Vanessa continued, sliding a contract across the desk. $300,000 annually with full benefits and accommodation on site. However, there are specific conditions. Grace scanned the first page, her eyebrows rising. "A non-disclosure agreement?" The Thaddeus name carries weight. "We can't risk any unflattering details reaching the press." Vanessa's perfectly lined lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Page 4 outlines the personal conduct requirements." Grace flipped to the indicated page, her eyes widening slightly. The contract explicitly prohibited any romantic or intimate relationships with the patient, his family members, or any Thaddeus Industries employees. Violation would result in immediate termination and substantial financial penalties. "Is this standard in your contracts?" Grace asked, keeping her tone neutral. "My brother is young, wealthy, and vulnerable," Vanessa's voice hardened. "You'd be surprised how many people see him as an opportunity rather than a patient. Now, shall we discuss your qualifications in detail?" Before Grace could respond, raised voices carried from the hallway. "I told you to stop bringing candidates without consulting me." Blake's voice was closer now, accompanied by the whir of an electric wheelchair. "I'm not one of your corporate acquisitions, Vanessa." The study door burst open. Grace turned, getting her first look at Blake Thaddeus. Dark hair fell across his forehead, partially hiding eyes that burned with fury. His shoulders were broad beneath his black sweater, his jaw clenched in anger. The wheelchair did nothing to diminish his commanding presence. His gaze cut to Grace, assessment turning to dismissal in an instant. "Another one? Let me save us all some time." "Not interested. Get out." "Blake," Vanessa snapped. "Ms. Mitchell is highly qualified." "I don't care if she's Florence Nightingale herself," Blake interrupted. "I don't need a babysitter, and I certainly don't need another spy reporting my every move to you." Grace stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. Every instinct from her years of nursing told her this was the crucial moment. She met Blake's hostile stare directly. "Mr. Thaddeus," she said calmly, "I can assure you I'm neither a babysitter nor a spy. I'm a rehabilitation nurse with a specialty in spinal cord injuries. If you're not interested in my professional services, I'll leave. But don't dismiss me because of assumptions about my intentions." The room went silent. Blake's eyes narrowed, really looking at her for the first time. Vanessa's perfectly manicured fingers drummed once against the desk, the only tell of her tension. "You're hired," Blake said abruptly. "What?" Vanessa's composure cracked. "I said she's hired." A bitter smile crossed Blake's face. "After all, sister dear, isn't that what you wanted? You've got your nurse. Now get out of my study." Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line, but she gathered the contract with efficient movements. "I'll have legal revise the paperwork. Ms. Mitchell, can you start Monday?" Grace looked between the siblings, reading the years of complexity in their interaction. Everything about this situation screamed warning signs. The contract's unusual clauses. The family tension. Blake's obvious resistance to care. It was without a doubt the most challenging case she'd ever been offered. "Monday works perfectly," she heard herself say. As she left the estate that morning, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped into something far more complicated than a standard nursing position. The contract in her bag felt heavy with unspoken expectations and hidden agendas. She had no way of knowing that the no romance clause would turn out to be the least of her concerns. "I see you didn't get the hint on Friday." Blake didn't look up from his laptop as Grace entered his study Monday morning. Most nurses quit after the first interview. Grace set her medical kit on a side table, taking in the room's transformation since her interview. Books that had been scattered across the floor now lined floor-to-ceiling shelves, their spines a rainbow of worn leather and faded cloth. Only the lingering scent of furniture polish betrayed Friday's chaos. "I'm not most nurses, Mr. Thaddeus." She pulled out her tablet, reviewing his schedule. "You have physical therapy at 10? Cancelled." His fingers continued flying across the keyboard. "Actually, no." Grace kept her voice neutral. "I confirmed with Dr. Sanders this morning. She's expecting us." Blake's typing stopped. He looked up, dark eyes challenging. "You've been here exactly 7 minutes and you're already overstepping. I can make my own appointments." "You can. But since you haven't attended PT in 3 weeks, your sister hired me to." "Ah yes, my sister." His laugh was sharp. "Tell me, how much is she paying you to spy on me? Beyond the official salary, I mean." Grace set down her tablet. "Mr. Thaddeus." "Blake." "What?" "If you're going to be my jailer, you might as well use my first name." He turned back to his laptop. "Though I doubt you'll last the week." Grace studied him for a moment. The defensive posture. The deliberate provocation. Classic deflection tactics she'd seen countless times, though rarely delivered with such precision. "You know what? You're right." She started packing up her kit. "This isn't going to work." That got his attention. "Giving up already?" "No, I'm going to wait in the hall until I'm dealing with Blake Thaddeus, the man, instead of this teenage impression of him." She headed for the door. "Let me know when he shows up. We leave for PT in 45 minutes. "You can't just," the wheelchair word as he turned to face her. "I'm your employer. Actually, Thaddeus Industries is my employer. You're my patient." She paused at the doorway. "And contrary to what you might think, those aren't the same thing." The door closed behind her with a satisfying click. Grace leaned against the wall, releasing a breath. Through the heavy wood, she heard what might have been a chuckle. 20 minutes later, the door opened. Blake emerged, his expression carefully neutral. "Physical therapy won't help. The damage is permanent." "The goal isn't to reverse the damage," Grace replied. "It's to prevent complications and maintain function in the areas you can still control." Ever the practical nurse. His tone was mocking, but some of the earlier hostility had faded. "Fine. Let's get this waste of time over with." The session was brutal. Dr. Sanders pushed Blake hard, and Grace watched him fight through each exercise with grim determination, refusing to acknowledge the sweat dripping down his face or the tremors in his arms. "Enough," he finally gasped after a particularly challenging set. "3 more, Dr. Sanders instructed." "I said enough." Blake's hand slammed against his wheelchair arm. "Or do I need to remind everyone who's paying for this torture?" "You're right," Grace interrupted, stepping forward. "That's enough for today." Dr. Sanders frowned. "Ms. Mitchell. We'll complete the set next time." Grace met Blake's surprised look. "When you're ready." The drive back to the estate was silent. As Grace helped Blake from the car, he spoke quietly. "You shouldn't have intervened. I don't need your pity." It wasn't pity. It was respect. She guided the wheelchair up the ramp. "You pushed yourself hard today. Knowing when to stop is just as important as knowing when to push." Inside, Blake unexpectedly turned toward the library instead of his study. Grace followed, expecting another confrontation. Instead, she found him staring at a shelf of Russian classics. "Dostoevsky," he said suddenly. "What's your take?" Grace blinked at the abrupt shift. "On which work?" "Notes from Underground." His eyes were testing, waiting for her to fumble. "Ah, the spite book." She smiled slightly at his startled expression. A man so consumed by his own bitterness that he'd rather destroy himself than accept help or connection. Sound familiar? Blake's laugh was genuine this time, if rusty from disuse. Touching. Did they teach literary analysis alongside bedside manner at nursing school? English major before nursing school, actually. Grace studied the shelves. Though I always preferred Bulgakov to Dostoevsky. The Master and Margarita? Heart of a Dog, actually. The idea that physical transformation doesn't necessarily lead to spiritual evolution. She trailed off, suddenly aware of the potential parallel. But Blake was nodding slowly. The body changes, but the essential nature remains the same. Unless. He wheeled closer to the shelves. Unless the spirit chooses to evolve. Grace watched as he selected a worn copy of the novel. "I haven't read this since college. Perhaps." He held out the book. "You could refresh my memory?" She accepted the book, recognition dawning. This wasn't just about literature. It was an olive branch. A way to connect without vulnerability. "I'd like that," she said simply. As she began to read aloud, Grace caught a glimpse of the man beneath the bitterness. The scholar, the thinker, the person who existed before the accident. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Neither of them mentioned the physical therapy session again that day. But the next morning, Blake was ready on time, the hostility replaced by quiet determination. And on his desk, a copy of Notes from Underground waited for Grace, a bookmark placed meaningfully at the protagonist's moment of transformation. 2 weeks into her new position, Grace sat cross-legged on her bed in the estate's guest wing, surrounded by Blake's medical files. The late-night review had become a ritual, though tonight something felt off. October 15th, vehicle collision. She muttered, comparing notes. Admitted to St. Michael's at 11:42 p.m. She frowned, pulling up another document. The hospital transfer records showed Blake arriving at Mount Sinai's trauma center at 1:15 a.m., less than 2 hours after the initial admission. For a critical spinal injury, the transfer seemed rushed, almost reckless. A knock at her door made her jump. "Come in." Vanessa entered, immaculate despite the late hour. Her eyes swept over the scattered papers. "Working overtime, Ms. Mitchell?" "Just reviewing Blake's history." Grace resisted the urge to hide the documents. "Some of these records seem incomplete." "Oh." Vanessa perched on the edge of a chair, her casual pose at odds with her sharp gaze. "What seems to be missing?" "The initial trauma report for one. And the transfer authorization. Bureaucratic oversights, I'm sure." Vanessa waved a manicured hand. "The accident was chaotic. Papers get lost. In my experience, trauma centers are quite thorough with their documentation." "Are you suggesting something, Ms. Mitchell?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Grace met Vanessa's stare. "Just trying to provide the best care possible for my patient." "Admirable." Vanessa stood. "Though I wonder if late-night detective work falls within your contracted duties." She paused at the door. "By the way, Blake's medication seems to be running low. I'll have my assistant handle the refills." "That won't be necessary. As his nurse, I should." "I insist." Vanessa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Good night, Ms. Mitchell." After she left, Grace pulled out her phone, scrolling to Dr. Sanders' number. The physical therapist had worked with Blake since the accident. Maybe she could shed light on the transfer. Her finger hovered over the call button. "I wouldn't." Grace startled. Blake sat in the doorway, his wheelchair silent on the thick carpet. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough." He moved into the room, glancing at the papers. "Interesting bedtime reading?" "Your sister thinks I'm overstepping." "My sister thinks everyone is overstepping." He picked up one of the reports. "What caught your attention?" Grace hesitated, then pointed to the timestamps. "This transfer. It's unusually quick for a spinal injury. And there's no documentation of who authorized it." Vanessa arranged it. "Said St. Michael's wasn't equipped for my type of injury." His expression darkened. "Though I was hardly in a position to argue at the time." "Do you remember anything about the accident?" "Flashes. I was driving home from the office. Late meeting about the Thompson merger." He rubbed his temples. "The brakes, they felt wrong. Then nothing until I woke up at Mount Sinai." "The brakes?" Grace sat up straighter. Was there an investigation? Vanessa handled everything. Said the police found no evidence of tampering. He laughed bitterly. Though given what you've found in these records, I'm starting to wonder what else she handled. A noise in the hallway made them both freeze. Blake quickly wheeled back toward the door. We shouldn't discuss this here. The walls have ears, or at least my sister's surveillance does. Wait. Grace gathered the most crucial documents. The rehabilitation wing is under renovation. We could. Tomorrow. After PT. He glanced over his shoulder. And Grace? Be careful with your questions. Vanessa's protection can become suffocation very quickly. The next morning, Grace found her medical kit rearranged, the locks on the medication cabinet changed. A note from Vanessa's assistant cited security protocols. During Blake's therapy session, Grace noticed an unfamiliar man in a suit watching from the hallway. When she looked again, he was gone. Your sister's new security? She asked Blake on the drive home. Probably. His jaw tightened. They usually show up when she's worried about something. Or someone. Back at the estate, Grace headed to the rehabilitation wing with her laptop, allegedly to inventory supplies. Instead, she began digging deeper into the accident reports. The browser history showed someone had accessed her computer while she was at therapy. That evening, as she helped Blake with his evening routine, their conversation stayed carefully neutral. But when she handed him his medication, he pressed a folded note into her palm. Later, in her room, Grace read the message, Thompson merger files. My study. Bottom drawer. Don't trust the house Wi-Fi. She crumpled the note, her mind racing. The merger meeting the night of the accident. The missing records. Vanessa's increasing surveillance. What had started as concern over medical discrepancies was evolving into something far more dangerous. And Grace was beginning to suspect that Blake's accident might not have been an accident at all. In the darkness of her room, she heard footsteps pass her door for the third time that night. Casual patrol or calculated intimidation. Either way, one thing was clear. She wasn't the only one looking beneath the surface anymore. The question was, who would find answers first? You don't have to do this, Blake said, watching Grace reorganize his study. I have people for filing. Your sister's people, you mean? Grace pulled another stack of folders from the bottom drawer. The same ones who've been following me around the estate? Blake wheeled closer, lowering his voice. You found the merger files? Not yet. She glanced at the door. Though your sister's assistant has been hovering all morning, probably making sure I don't. As if on cue, heels clicked past the study. Grace waited until they faded before continuing her search. Tell me about Thompson Industries, she whispered, sorting through documents. Why was that merger so important? Blake's hands tightened on his wheelchair arms. It was meant to be my legacy. Taking a family company and turning it into something bigger. The deal would have doubled our market share. His expression darkened. Instead, I got a wheelchair and Vanessa got control of everything. But you're still the majority shareholder, right? On paper. He laughed without humor. Try exercising control when you can't even access your own office building. Grace pulled out another folder, this one older and water-stained. What's this? Probably more quarterly reports. Vanessa loves her. Blake stopped, eyes fixed on the papers Grace was spreading across his desk. They weren't quarterly reports. These are wire transfers, Grace said slowly. All to the same offshore account, starting 3 months before your accident. Blake leaned forward, scanning the documents. Those amounts, they're exactly what we were planning to offer Thompson's shareholders. But the merger never happened. No. Blake's voice was tight. Because I never made it to the final meeting. The money disappeared, the deal fell through, and Thompson ended up selling to our biggest competitor instead. Grace traced the account numbers with her finger. And no one investigated? Vanessa said she hired auditors. Found nothing. He met Grace's eyes. But these transfers, they're authorized with my electronic signature. Could someone have access my private codes? Only 2 people had them. His jaw clenched. Me and my trusted sister who helped build the company's security systems. A creak in the hallway made them both freeze. Grace quickly gathered the documents, but not before snapping photos with her phone. The door opened. Vanessa stood there, elegant as always in cream silk. Blake, darling, the board is asking about the quarterly meeting. I told you, I'm not playing puppet CEO for your presentations. They're concerned about the company's direction. Vanessa's eyes flickered to the papers in Grace's hands. What are you working on? Just organizing, Grace said smoothly. Mr. Thaddeus asked me to help with his files. How thoughtful. Vanessa stepped closer. Though surely that's not part of your nursing duties? Actually, Blake interrupted, I've asked Grace to help me prepare for returning to work. Vanessa's perfect composure slipped for just a moment. Return to? Blake, be reasonable. In your condition. My condition doesn't affect my mind, sister dear. His smile was razor-sharp. Or my right to run my company. Of course not. Vanessa recovered quickly. We'll discuss this later. Ms. Mitchell, a word. In the hallway, Vanessa's warmth vanished. You're becoming quite involved in matters beyond your role. I'm helping my patient regain independence. Grace kept her voice professional. Isn't that what you hired me for? I hired you to manage his physical therapy, not encourage delusions about returning to work. Vanessa stepped closer. Remember your contract, Ms. Mitchell? Overstepping boundaries has consequences. After she left, Grace returned to find Blake staring out the window. She's right, you know, he said quietly. I can't just walk back into the boardroom. No, Grace agreed, setting the folder on his desk. But you can fight back. He turned to face her. Why are you helping me? Really? Because it's my job to help you heal. She met his gaze. All of you, not just your body. Something shifted in his expression. For a moment, the bitterness faded, replaced by something warmer, more vulnerable. Grace, The moment shattered as his phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa, dinner with the board tomorrow. Non-negotiable. Grace felt the familiar tension between professional distance and personal concern. The contract's no romance clause seemed to mock her from the drawer where she'd found the transfers. We should get you ready for PT, she said, stepping back. Right. Blake's walls came up again. Wouldn't want to miss my sister's carefully scheduled therapy session. But as Grace gathered her things, she felt his eyes on her, filled with the same questions she was trying to ignore. The transfers proved Vanessa's betrayal. But acting on that proof meant acknowledging how much she'd come to care about more than just Blake's physical recovery. In her pocket, her phone felt heavy with evidence. In her chest, her heart felt heavier with the weight of decisions to come. The board dinner was a disaster from the start. Grace watched from the kitchen as Vanessa paraded Blake before the directors like a show pony, her hand possessively on his wheelchair. The message was clear. Poor Blake, still unable to lead, still needing his sister's careful guidance. Another drink, Mr. Thaddeus? Vanessa's assistant hovered nearby with a wine bottle. I can manage, Blake said coldly, but his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass. Grace saw the flash of frustration cross his face. Perhaps some water instead, Vanessa suggested, loud enough for the directors to hear. With your medication. Blake's glass slammed down. Enough. The room went silent. One of the director's wives jumped, her fork clattering against fine china. Blake, Vanessa's tone was warning. You're tired? Perhaps we should. Perhaps you should stop treating me like an invalid. Blake's voice was low, dangerous. Or have you forgotten who built this company while you were still playing secretary? Color flooded Vanessa's cheeks. I think the accident has affected your memory, dear brother. Who handled operations when Dad died? Who kept us afloat during the recession? Who transferred millions to offshore accounts before my convenient accident? The words hung in the air like smoke. Grace saw several directors exchange glances. I don't know what you're talking about. Vanessa's composure cracked slightly. The accident was thoroughly investigated. Like the Thompson merger? Like the missing audit reports? Blake wheeled away from the table. Tell me, sister, did you plan it from the start or did the opportunity just present itself? You're not well. Vanessa turned to the directors, all sympathy. You see what I'm dealing with? The paranoia, the accusations, the truth? Blake pulled out his phone. Should we call the mechanic who serviced my car that night? The one who disappeared the next day with a very generous severance package. Vanessa went still. Everyone, please excuse us. My brother needs his rest. The directors filed out quickly, murmuring polite goodbyes. Grace pretended to busy herself with medication prep, staying within earshot. As soon as the door closed, Vanessa rounded on Blake. Have you lost your mind? Those are our major shareholders. No, they're my shareholders. Just like this is my company. Or have you forgotten that while playing CO? Everything I've done has been to protect you. Protect me? Blake laughed bitterly. Is that what you told Dad on his deathbed? That you'd protect me? Don't you dare bring him into this. Why not? He saw through you, you know. That's why he left me controlling interest. His last words to me were to watch my back around you. The sound of the slap echoed through the room. Grace stepped forward instinctively but froze at what she heard next. "You ungrateful bastard," Vanessa hissed. "I should have made sure those brakes failed completely." The admission hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then Vanessa's phone rang, shattering the moment. She answered it mechanically, turning away. "Yes, no, stick to the plan. If he doesn't sign the transfer papers by Friday, proceed with the alternate arrangement. No traces." Grace backed away quietly, her heart pounding. She had to warn Blake. But as she turned, she collided with a solid chest, one of Vanessa's security men. "Ms. Mitchell," he smiled without warmth. "Miss Thaddeus would like you to take the rest of the night off. I need to give Blake his medication." "It's been handled." The man's hand closed around her arm, steering her toward the door. Hours later, Grace paced in her room, waiting for the guard posted outside to change shifts. The moment she heard footsteps retreating, she slipped out. Blake's room was dark when she entered, but he was awake, staring out the window. "I heard everything," she said softly. "Did you get it recorded?" "No. I'm sorry." He nodded, unsurprised. "She'll deny it all by morning. Blame my medication, stress, anything to discredit me." "Blake." Grace moved closer. "That call. She's planning something. Something worse than the accident." "I know." His voice was tired, defeated in a way she'd never heard before. She's always been good at contingency plans. Without thinking, Grace reached for his hand. He gripped it like a lifeline. "I can't let her win," he whispered. "Not just for me. For Dad. For everyone she's hurt trying to get control. We'll find proof." Grace knelt beside his chair. "The transfers, the mechanic, the missing reports. It's not enough." His other hand came up, brushing her cheek. "And I can't risk you getting caught in the crossfire. If anything happened to you." The touch sent electricity through her skin. Every warning bell, every professional boundary screamed at her to pull away. Instead, she leaned closer. "I'm already involved," she breathed. "And I'm not leaving you to face this alone." In the darkness, his eyes searched hers. The walls he'd built, the bitterness he'd hidden behind, all of it crumbled in that moment. When his lips met hers, it felt like falling, like breaking, like finally finding solid ground. The contract lay forgotten in her room, its no romance clause as shattered as the professional distance between them. But as Grace melted into the kiss, she couldn't bring herself to care. Some things were worth breaking for. Grace found the envelope on her pillow the next morning. Inside, a cashier's check for $500,000 and a first-class plane ticket to London. Generous severance package? She turned to find Vanessa in her doorway, impeccable in a steel gray suit despite the early hour. "I haven't resigned," Grace said, keeping her voice steady. "Consider it a mutual parting of ways." Vanessa stepped into the room. "You've become emotionally compromised. It's best for everyone if you make a fresh start. Far from here." Grace held up the check. "And this buys your peace of mind?" "That buys your silence." Vanessa's smile was shark-like. "About certain conversations you may have overheard. Conversations that, if misconstrued, could damage the company's reputation." "You mean conversations about brake failures and missing mechanics?" The smile vanished. "Careful, Ms. Mitchell. Not everyone who leaves this house goes to London." She glanced meaningfully at the wheelchair ramp visible through the window. "Some exits are more permanent." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm offering you an opportunity. Take it." Vanessa moved to leave, then paused. "Oh, and that kiss last night? Consider it your last. The next time you breach your contract's romance clause, the consequences won't be nearly as pleasant as a paid vacation." After she left, Grace sank onto her bed, hands shaking. She pulled out her phone, then remembered the house Wi-Fi wasn't secure. Instead, she grabbed her keys. "Going somewhere?" The security guard's voice stopped her at the front door. "Physical therapy supplies," she lied smoothly. "We're running low on resistance bands." He nodded to another guard. "Jim will drive you." "That's not." "Miss Thaddeus insists." The message was clear. She wasn't going anywhere alone anymore. In the medical supply store, Grace pretended to browse while typing a note on her phone. "V offered buyout. Threats made. Under surveillance. Need secure way to communicate." Back at the estate, she slipped the phone into Blake's jacket pocket during his afternoon therapy session, making it look like she was adjusting his posture. Hours later, she found his reply hidden in her medical kit. "Burner phones in maintenance shed. Password to security system. Dad's birthday. Midnight." Grace spent the evening performing her usual routine, hyper-aware of the eyes watching her every move. At 11, she prepared Blake's medications, making a show of checking on him one last time. "Everything okay?" he asked as she adjusted his blankets, his tone casual but his eyes intense. "Perfect," she smiled, slipping him the check from Vanessa. "Just a normal night." His fingers brushed hers, sending electricity through her skin. "Sleep well, Grace." At midnight, she used Blake's father's birthday to disable the security cameras for 3 minutes. Enough time to sprint to the maintenance shed and back. Inside her room, heart pounding, she found 2 prepaid phones and a note. "Delete everything after reading. V has IT monitoring all devices." Over the next few days, they developed a careful routine. Grace would help Blake with therapy, maintaining professional distance under Vanessa's watchful eye. But their hands would brush, papers would be exchanged, and burner phones would buzz with encrypted messages late at night. "Found the mechanic," Blake texted one night. "Living in Mexico. Willing to talk." "V's planning something for Friday," Grace replied. Overhead, her assistant, papers ready for signing. "Forced transfer of company control. Need proof of fraud before then." "Security cameras from accident night? Deleted. But backup servers at office." Grace stared at the message. The office, where Vanessa now ruled supreme. "Too dangerous," she texted. "They're watching me. Not watching maintenance staff. Jamie owes me. Getting keycard tomorrow." Blake, "No. If they catch you." "Already caught, Grace. Been caught since the accident. Time to break free." She pressed the phone to her forehead, fear and frustration warring in her chest. The professional part of her knew she should walk away. Take the money. Save herself. But then she remembered the defeat in Blake's voice when he talked about his father. The way Vanessa paraded him like a puppet. The growing warmth in his eyes when they were alone. "I'm coming with you," she texted. "No. Too risky. You can't manage the elevator alone. Need medical supervision anyway, professional obligation." A long pause. Then, "Tomorrow night. 11 p.m. Loading dock." Grace deleted the messages, her decision made. The game was dangerous, but they were playing it together now. Later, organizing Blake's evening medications, she found a folded note. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know that meeting you was worth all of it." She tucked the note away next to her heart and began preparing for their riskiest move yet. Tomorrow they'd either find the proof they needed, or Vanessa would finally win her game. The Thaddeus Industries building loomed against the night sky, most of its windows dark except for the security lights. Grace pushed Blake's wheelchair through the loading dock, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Jamie came through," Blake whispered, holding up the keycard. "Security cameras are on a loop for the next hour." The service elevator hummed softly as they ascended to the executive floor. Grace's hands never left the wheelchair handles, though whether to steady Blake or herself, she wasn't sure. "My office is at the end of the hall," Blake directed. "Vanessa hasn't changed anything. Wants to maintain appearances for the board." The office was exactly as Blake had left it the night of the accident. Calendar still turned to October. Half-empty coffee mug on the desk. Even his jacket still hung on the coat rack. "Like a tomb," Blake muttered, wheeling to his computer. "Password still the same. Vanessa never knew about my private server." Grace kept watch at the door while Blake accessed the files. The click of his keyboard felt deafening in the empty building. "Got it," he breathed. "The original Thompson merger documents. And something else." Grace moved to look over his shoulder. On the screen, security footage showed the underground parking garage. Date stamp, October 15th. "That's the night of your accident." They watched as a figure in a maintenance uniform approached Blake's car, working underneath it for several minutes. When the figure stood, the face was clear, Vanessa's current head of security. "Keep watching," Blake said grimly. The footage switched to a different camera. Vanessa appeared, speaking to the same man. Money changed hands. The timestamp was 30 minutes before Blake's accident. "She really did try to kill me." Blake's voice was hollow. "Her own brother." Grace squeezed his shoulder. "We need to download everything." As Blake transferred the files, Grace searched Vanessa's adjoining office. In the bottom drawer, she found a folder marked Contingency. "Blake." Her hands shook as she read. "She's got papers ready for tomorrow. Medical declarations of your mental incompetency. Power of attorney transfers. Once you sign, she'll have complete control." Blake's laugh was bitter. "And if I refuse to sign?" Grace held up another document. "There's a prescription here. Heavy sedatives. Blake, I think she's planning to. A noise in the hallway cut her off. Footsteps. They froze, staring at each other in panic. Grace quickly gathered the documents while Blake finished the download. The footsteps grew closer. The executive washroom, Blake whispered urgently. Connected to both offices. Grace pushed his wheelchair through the hidden door just as voices became audible. Sweep the building again, Vanessa was saying. My brother's nurse has been asking questions. If she's found anything. We've got people watching her place, a male voice responded. She hasn't left the estate. Grace and Blake exchanged looks. She'd left her burner phone in her room as a decoy. Check the offices anyway, Vanessa ordered. And make sure everything's ready for tomorrow. Once Blake signs those papers, none of this will matter. And if he doesn't sign? Then we move to Plan B. The doctors already have their instructions. Such a tragedy. Overcome by grief and paranoia, he took his own life. Grace felt Blake's hand find hers in the darkness, squeezing tight. The office doors opened. Flashlight beams swept the rooms. Clear, the male voice reported. Check the servers, Vanessa commanded. Any unauthorized access. Blake pulled Grace closer, his arm wrapping around her waist as they pressed against the washroom wall. Her heart thundered so loudly she was sure they'd hear it. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, the footsteps receded. They're gone, Grace breathed, but neither of them moved. The warmth of Blake's arm around her, the solid strength of him even in the wheelchair, it anchored her against the terror of what they'd just heard. Grace. His voice was rough. You have to get out of here. Take the evidence and go. She's going to. Stop. She turned in his arms, facing him in the dim light. I'm not leaving you. This isn't your fight. Like hell it isn't. Her hands framed his face. I'm your nurse, remember? Protecting my patient's well-being is literally in my job description. His laugh was shaky. Pretty sure that contract didn't cover corporate espionage and attempted murder. The contract also said no romance. She leaned closer. I think we've already broken that one. His kiss was desperate, hungry, full of fear and need and something deeper neither of them dared name. Grace poured everything into it, her fear for him, her rage at Vanessa, her absolute certainty that she couldn't walk away. When they finally broke apart, Blake rested his forehead against hers. We have to stop her. Before tomorrow. We will. Grace held up the flash drive and documents. We've got proof of everything now. The fraud, the accident, tomorrow's plans. It's not enough to just expose her. Blake's voice hardened. She'll twist it, claim I'm paranoid, use those medical declarations. Then we don't go public. Grace's mind raced. We go to the one place she can't control. The board? Better. Grace smiled grimly. We go to your father's oldest friend. The district attorney. Understanding dawned in Blake's eyes. Daniel Crawford. Dad's college roommate. The one person Vanessa could never buy. Can you reach him? Tonight. Blake nodded. He gave me his private number after Dad died. Said to call if I ever needed anything. His laugh was bitter. Guess he knew my sister better than I did. As they planned their next move, Grace kept her hand in Blake's, drawing strength from the connection. Tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. But tonight, in the darkness of the hidden washroom, with proof of Vanessa's crimes in their possession and their hearts finally aligned, they'd found something neither expected. A partnership that went far beyond nurse and patient. And they'd need every bit of that strength for what was to come. The Thaddeus Estates boardroom was silent except for the gentle ticking of the antique clock, a sound that had irritated Vanessa since childhood. She stood at the head of the table, documents spread before her, waiting for Blake to arrive for the morning meeting. Everything's ready, her assistant whispered. The doctors are standing by if needed. Vanessa nodded, adjusting the papers one final time. After today the company would be hers completely. One way or another. The door opened. Blake entered, Grace pushing his wheelchair. Vanessa's perfect smile flickered at the sight of the nurse. She should have been long gone by now. Good morning, brother dear. Ms. Mitchell, I don't believe your presence is necessary for this family matter. She stays, Blake said quietly. We have something you need to see first. Vanessa's fingers twitched against the polished table. The papers can't wait. The board will be very interested in these other papers. Blake nodded to Grace, who placed a folder on the table. Especially the ones about the Thompson merger. The room's temperature seemed to drop. Vanessa's assistant took a step toward the door, but Grace was already there, blocking it. I don't know what you think you've found, Vanessa began, but in your condition with the medication affecting your judgment? You mean these medications? Grace held up a bottle. The ones you were planning to use to stage his suicide? Vanessa's composure cracked. You went through my office. Like you went through my car? Blake wheeled closer. Or should we ask your head of security about that night? I'm sure the district attorney would love his testimony. You contacted Daniel? For the first time, real fear flashed across Vanessa's face. He's on his way. Along with the FBI's corporate fraud division. Blake's voice was steel. It's over, Vanessa. She laughed, the sound brittle. You fool. You have no idea what you're doing. This company is all we have. No, Blake countered. This company is all you have. I had something more. I had a sister I trusted. A sister I loved. Love. Vanessa spat the word. Where was your love when Dad chose you to lead? When he passed over me who spent my life learning every detail of this business while you played entrepreneur with his money. Dad didn't choose me over you, Blake said softly. He chose us both. Wanted us to lead together. Liar. Vanessa slammed her hands on the table. I saw the will. Everything went to you. Because he knew you'd never accept being equal partners. You had to control everything, Vanessa. Just like you tried to control my recovery, my nurses, my whole life after the accident. I was protecting you. You were caging me. Blake pulled out a security footage printout. Just like you tried to kill me when I wouldn't play by your rules. Vanessa stared at the image herself, handing money to the man who sabotaged Blake's car. Her hands began to shake. I never meant, you weren't supposed to be hurt that badly. Just enough to delay the merger. Give me time to move the money. Time to steal everything Dad built? Blake's voice cracked. Time to destroy your own brother? You don't understand, Vanessa whispered. I couldn't let you ruin it. The Thompson merger would have changed everything. Outside investors, new board members. I would have lost control. It was never yours to control. Blake's fist hit his wheelchair arm. Dad built this company for both of us. He built it for his son. Vanessa screamed. 25 years I worked by his side. But one word from his precious boy and my opinions meant nothing. The merger, the expansion plans, he threw away my life's work because you batted your eyes and played visionary. The door burst open. Daniel Crawford entered, flanked by federal agents. Hello, Vanessa. The district attorney's voice was grim. We need to talk about corporate fraud, attempted murder, and a few other charges. Vanessa's face went blank. Her hand darted to her purse. Don't, Grace warned, but Vanessa was already pulling out a small revolver. I won't let you destroy everything, she said, her voice eerily calm. I won't let you take my company. Vanessa, please. Blake wheeled forward despite Grace's attempted restraint. Put the gun down. We can still fix this. Fix it? Vanessa laughed wildly. Like you fixed me? Poor, controlling Vanessa. Jealous Vanessa. Never good enough Vanessa. The gun wavered between Blake and the agents. I built this company as much as Dad did. More. While you were off at college, I was here. Every late night, every crisis, every decision. I earned this. You're right. Everyone stared at Blake. You did earn it, he continued softly. You were brilliant at running the company. That's why Dad wanted us to lead together. My vision, your expertise. We could have been unstoppable. Don't, Vanessa choked. Don't pretend you ever saw me as an equal. You're my sister. Blake's voice broke. You were my hero growing up. Every skin knee, every nightmare, you were there. When Mom died, you practically raised me. How did we end up here, Van? The childhood nickname hit her like a physical blow. The gun lowered slightly. I just wanted. She whispered. I needed. I know. Blake held out his hand. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away. Sister and brother, before ambition and bitterness poisoned everything. Then Vanessa's face hardened. Too late, she said, raising the gun. 2 shots rang out. Vanessa crumpled as federal agents tackled her, their own weapons drawn. The gun she'd fired had gone wide, leaving a hole in the ceiling. As agents swarmed the room and Daniel began reading charges, Grace knelt beside Blake's wheelchair. Are you okay? She whispered. He stared at his sister being handcuffed, tears sliding down his face. No, he said honestly. But I will be. Grace took his hand, holding on as his world shifted on its axis. Outside, reporters were already gathering, drawn by the FBI presence. Tomorrow, headlines would scream about corporate fraud and family betrayal. But for now, in the wreckage of his family legacy, Blake held on to the one thing his sister couldn't take. The heart of a nurse who chose to stay when she could have run, who helped him find truth when lies were easier, who loved him not in spite of his wounds but including them. Some things, it turned out, were stronger than blood. Thaddeus Industries CEO arrested in corporate fraud scandal, Grace read from the morning paper. She sat in Blake's study, where they'd spent so many hours reading Russian literature together. Now those books lay untouched, replaced by newspapers and legal documents. "They're calling it the betrayal of the decade," Blake said from the window. "Though the attempted murder charges are getting more attention than the fraud." 2 weeks had passed since Vanessa's arrest. The estate felt hollow without her commanding presence, though her absence had revealed other changes too. The security guards were gone. The surveillance cameras were dark. Even the air felt lighter, less suffocating. But new tensions had taken root. "The board wants to meet tomorrow," Blake continued. "They're expecting me to resume control immediately. Is that what you want?" He turned his wheelchair to face her. "What I want." His voice trailed off as their eyes met. The unspoken thing between them hung heavy in the air. Since Vanessa's arrest, they'd maintained careful distance, both physical and emotional. The professional boundaries they'd broken now seemed to rebuild themselves, brick by uncertain brick. "Your contract technically ended when Vanessa was arrested," Blake said quietly. "I know. The board's bringing in a new rehabilitation specialist. From Switzerland. I saw the paperwork." Grace folded the newspaper, needing something to do with her hands. "Dr. Weber has an excellent reputation." "Grace. It's the right decision," she interrupted. "You need someone objective. Someone who can focus on your physical therapy without complications." "Is that what we are? A complication?" She stood, pacing to the bookshelves where they'd first connected over Bulgakov. "We broke every rule, Blake. Professional ethics, the contract." "A contract my sister wrote to control me," he countered. "To keep me isolated. That doesn't make what we did right." "No." He wheeled closer. "Tell me something. If you hadn't gotten close to me, hadn't crossed those lines, would you have fought so hard to uncover the truth?" Grace turned, frustration coloring her voice. "That's exactly the problem. I compromised my professional judgment. I got emotionally involved with a patient. I stopped being just a patient the moment you saw me as a person, not a diagnosis." Blake caught her hand. "And you stopped being just a nurse the moment you risked everything to help me fight back." She didn't pull away, but her voice shook. "The medical board would revoke my license if they knew. Then we tell them the truth. That you maintained professional distance until you discovered criminal activity. That your actions were about justice, not romance. Was that all it was?" The question hung between them. Blake tugged her hand gently, drawing her down to his level. "You know it wasn't," he said softly. "Just like you know this isn't about professional boundaries anymore. You're afraid." "Of course I'm afraid." The words burst out. "I watched your sister try to kill you. I saw what blind ambition and control did to your family. How can I trust that what I'm feeling isn't just trauma bonding? How can you? Because I felt it before we uncovered her crimes. That first day in the library when you called me out on my Dostoevsky comparison." His hand came up to cup her cheek. "You saw me, Grace. Not the bitter paraplegic, not the wealthy CO, just me." She leaned into his touch despite herself. "The board won't like it. The shareholders. Let me worry about them." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "Right now, I need to know, are you running away because of ethics or because you're scared of what's real between us?" Grace closed her eyes, tears slipping free. "Both," she whispered. "Neither. I don't know anymore." Blake pulled back slightly, though his hand remained on her face. "Then let me make it easier. Take the job in Chicago." Her eyes flew open. "What?" "The rehabilitation center offered you a position. I saw the letter." "You went through my mail?" "It was on your desk," he said quietly. "Take it. Get distance. Figure out what you want away from all this chaos." His smile was sad. "I'll still be here. Some things are worth waiting for." Grace stared at him, this man who'd fought his way back from betrayal and loss, who was now offering her the space to find her own truth. "3 months," she said finally. "Give me 3 months to sort out my head. My heart." 3 months, he agreed. "And then?" She leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of endings and beginnings. "And then we'll know if what we built is strong enough to stand on its own. Without crimes to solve or secrets to uncover. Just us. Just us." As she left the study, Grace paused in the doorway. Blake? The Master and Margarita. He looked puzzled. What about it? That's what we'll read when I come back. She smiled softly. A story about love that transcends boundaries, remember? His answering smile carried the warmth of promise. I'll have it waiting. The door closed between them, but it felt less like an ending than a pause. A breath between chapters. After all, the best Russian novels took their time building to the truth. 3 months could feel like an eternity or a heartbeat. For Grace, packing up her room at the Thaddeus estate, it somehow felt like both. Leave the medical texts, Blake said from the doorway. They'll be useful for the next nurse. Dr. Weber, Grace corrected, setting the books aside. After all this, you deserve the best rehabilitation specialist in Europe. I had the best already. She paused in her packing, the words hitting harder than she'd expected. Outside, autumn was painting the estate grounds in shades of gold and crimson. Soon the trees would be bare, waiting for renewal. The Chicago position starts next week, she said, focusing on folding a sweater. A whole ward of patients who need help learning to trust their bodies again. And one here who learned to trust his heart because of you. Grace turned, finding Blake closer than she'd expected. His wheelchair handling had improved dramatically in the past weeks. One of many changes she'd witnessed. The board meeting went well yesterday, she said, changing the subject. I saw the stock prices rising. They're calling it a remarkable recovery. His smile held irony. Though I don't think they're talking about my physical therapy. You've done amazing work, Blake. The company, the rehabilitation program you're funding. The Scholarship Foundation for Nursing Students, he added. Approved this morning. Named after a certain nurse who taught me the difference between healing and hiding. Grace's hands stilled on her suitcase. Blake. I know, he said softly. We need this time. You need to find yourself beyond what happened here. Beyond us. And you need to learn who you are without Vanessa's shadow. He nodded, though his eyes never left hers. She's accepted the plea deal. 20 years minimum. Have you visited her? Not yet. His hands tightened on the wheelchair arms. Some wounds need more time to heal. Grace understood. She knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. Promise me something? Anything. Don't let this make you bitter again. Don't let her take anything more from you. His fingers interlaced with hers. I won't. I have something now that her betrayal can't touch. What's that? Hope. He brought their joined hands to his lips. And a very good reason to keep working on my recovery. A car horn sounded outside, her taxi to the airport. That's my cue, Grace whispered. 3 months, Blake reminded her. 3 months. She stood, gathering her courage with her bags. Though I might check in occasionally. Purely professional interest in your rehabilitation, of course. Of course. His smile was knowing. I might send you updates. Strictly medical progress reports. With perhaps a few literary discussions mixed in? Well, someone needs to defend Dostoevsky's honor in your absence. They shared a laugh that felt like remembering how to breathe. Then Grace shouldered her bag and the moment of parting arrived. Blake, Don't, he said gently. Not yet. Save it for when you come back. If you come back. When, she corrected. Some stories deserve proper endings. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a wrapped package. Speaking of stories, Grace opened it to find a first edition of The Master and Margarita. For when you return, Blake said. A reminder that love doesn't always follow rules or contracts. She clutched the book to her chest, fighting tears. I don't know if I can. You can. We can. He smiled, though his eyes were bright. After all, what's 3 months compared to eternity? The taxi honked again. Grace bent down, pressing one last kiss to Blake's lips. A promise, a goodbye, a beginning. Then she walked away, her steps sure despite her blurring vision. At the door, she turned back one final time. Blake sat in his wheelchair, backlit by autumn sunlight, watching her go. Not with bitterness or desperation, but with the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned that some bonds grow stronger with distance. 3 месяца. He called in perfect Russian. 3 months, she echoed. The door closed between them, but it felt like opening rather than ending. Outside, leaves danced on the wind, letting go so new growth could begin. Grace stepped into the waiting taxi, holding her book of impossible love against her heart. Behind her, the Thaddeus estate stood peaceful in the October light, its shadows finally beginning to fade. Some battles were worth fighting. Some rules were worth breaking. and some loves were worth the wait. After all, as any good Russian novel would tell you, the deepest truths often take the longest to unfold. Share your perspective in the comments below. Let us know where you're watching from, and tell us about a time when you had to choose between professional duty and matters of the heart. How did you navigate that difficult decision? Remember to turn on notifications so you never miss our latest stories.